Long before Spain carried its name, long before kings and crowns, the Iberian Peninsula was already ancient, already full of life and struggle. Millennia ago, deep inside the caves of Altamira, hunters gathered in the glow of flickering firelight. Their hands stained with ochre, they painted bison, deer, and wild horses, as if to capture their prey forever on the stone walls. To them, the art was not mere decoration. It was magic, a prayer for survival, a bond with forces they could not see but felt in every hunt. Spain's first voice was painted in silence, a language of fire and pigment. As centuries rolled forward, the land filled with tribes. On the Mediterranean coasts, the Iberians built fortified towns of stone and clay, trading, farming, and crafting iron tools. In the misty mountains of Galicia and Asturias, the Celts roamed, their warriors carrying bronze swords and round shields, their druids chanting in sacred groves. Over generations, the Iberians and Celts mingled into the Celtiberians, fierce defenders of their rugged plateau. Their hilltop fortresses overlooked valleys of wheat and rivers of silver, riches that would one day tempt the empires beyond the sea. But Iberia could not remain isolated. From the east came Phoenician sailors, their ships laden with amphorae of wine, salt, and purple dye. They founded Gadir, a bustling port where eastern merchants met western tribes. Greeks arrived after them, planting olive groves and vineyards, carving out colonies along the coast. Carthaginians followed, traders turned conquerors, establishing strongholds and armies. Iberia became a chessboard of powers, its soil contested long before Spain itself was born. The clash between Rome and Carthage decided Iberia's fate. When Hannibal marched over the Alps with elephants, much of his army had been hardened in Iberia's hills. But when Rome crushed Carthage in the Punic Wars, the peninsula was absorbed into a new empire. Hispania was no longer a land of scattered tribes. It was Rome's western jewel. Roman legions cut roads through forests and mountains, each stone placed with discipline and foresight. Soldiers built fortresses that grew into towns, while aqueducts arched across valleys, carrying water into baths, fountains, and gardens. Latin spread like wildfire, mixing with native speech until new dialects took root. Cities blossomed. Tarraco as a capital of the Northeast, Emerita Augusta as a monument of retired soldiers, and Corduba as a thriving hub of trade. Hispania produced emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, men who would rule not just provinces, but the entire Roman world. It produced Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, whose words still echo through history. We are waves of the same sea. Yet Roman rule was not always welcome. Rebellions flared, most famously led by Viriathus, the shepherd-turned-warrior who united Celtiberians against Rome. For years, his guerrilla fighters harassed legions, striking in forests and vanishing into hills. Rome could conquer, but it could not crush Iberia's wild spirit easily. Even after Viriathus fell, the land remained a frontier, a place of resistance and resilience. By the time Rome reached its height, Hispania was fully integrated. Its olive oil, wine, and grain fed the empire. Its silver filled the coffers of emperors. Latin carved itself into the people's tongue, laying the foundations of Spanish, Portuguese, and Catalan. Amphitheaters roared with gladiatorial combat, Villas sprawled in the countryside. Mosaics told stories in colored stone. For centuries, Hispania was Rome, and Rome was Hispania. But Rome's power waned. Corruption, invasions, and collapse spread across the empire. Germanic tribes surged through the Pyrenees. Among them, the Visigoths carved out a kingdom, taking Toledo as their capital. They blended Roman law with their own customs, drafting the Visigothic Code, one of Europe's first attempts at a unified law. For 3 centuries, they held Spain in uneasy stability, until a storm blew across the Strait of Gibraltar in 711, forever changing the destiny of the land. Spain entered a new age of faith, power, and conflict. By the 11th century, the Reconquista was no longer a distant dream, but a rolling tide. Small kingdoms in the north grew bold, uniting and clashing in their quest to retake the land from Muslim control. Castile, Aragon, Leon, and Navarre rose as mighty powers, each forging its own destiny. The Christian knights, clad in steel, rode against the Moorish cavalry across plains soaked with centuries of blood. In this crucible of war, culture did not die, but flourished. The Camino de Santiago became a holy pilgrimage route, attracting thousands from across Europe, blending faith with trade and knowledge. Cathedrals began to pierce the skies of Burgos and Leon, symbols of both piety and pride. Still, the convivencia, the uneasy coexistence between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, created a society unlike any other, one of astonishing architecture, mathematics, and philosophy, even as wars raged on. The 13th century marked decisive victories. Ferdinand III of Castile captured Córdoba and Seville, while James I of Aragon took Valencia and the Balearic Islands. The Alhambra rose in Granada, a palace of breathtaking beauty, a final jewel of Al-Andalus that stood defiantly against encroaching Christian armies. But the fate of Muslim Spain was sealed. By 1492, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs, united their crowns, driving the last Nasrid ruler from Granada. With one stroke, the Reconquista ended, and a new Spain was born. The year 1492 was both an ending and a beginning. With Granada taken and Columbus's voyage opening the new world, Spain leapt onto the stage of world power. Ships laden with treasure sailed across the Atlantic, bringing gold, silver, and riches unimaginable. The Spanish Empire stretched across continents, from Mexico and Peru to the Philippines, becoming the first global empire. Yet empire brought both glory and burden. The wealth built magnificent cathedrals and funded armies that dominated Europe, but it also fueled endless wars. Against France, against Protestant reformers, against the Ottoman Empire. Spain became the sword of Catholicism, its faith unyielding, enforced at home by the Spanish Inquisition. The voices of dissent were silenced, while missionaries crossed oceans to spread Christianity. The 16th century shone brightly. Charles V ruled a realm where the sun never set, and Philip II presided over Spain's golden age. Madrid became the capital, The Escorial Monastery Palace rose in solemn majesty, and artists like El Greco painted visions of heaven and earth. But shadows grew. Inflation devoured the silver's value. Rebellions stirred in the Netherlands, and the fateful Armada of 1588, Spain's invincible fleet, was shattered by English fire and storm. Still, Spain's golden age endured in spirit. Writers like Miguel de Cervantes crafted Don Quixote, the novel that captured Spain's dreams and disillusionments. Painters like Diego Velázquez immortalized kings and jesters with piercing realism. But behind the splendor, decline crept in. Wars drained the treasury, plague ravaged the land, and the empire's glory began to crumble. By the 17th century, Spain stood tall in name, but weary in reality. The flow of silver from the Americas slowed, yet wars across Europe never ceased. The Habsburg kings, obsessed with dynastic struggles, drained the empire's lifeblood on distant battlefields. Spain became a hollow empire, majestic in image, but weakened within. Peasants bore heavy taxes, famine stalked the countryside, and plagues decimated towns. The glittering facade of the Golden Age masked a nation straining under its own greatness. Still, Spain produced brilliance amid the decay. Diego Velázquez painted masterpieces at the royal court, his brush capturing both the grandeur of monarchs and the humanity of dwarfs, jesters, and maids. Lope de Vega and Calderón de la Barca filled theaters with plays that spoke to Spain's soul, tragic, devout, and passionate. This paradox defined the age, an empire in decline, but a culture in its zenith. But decay could not be hidden forever. In 1640, Catalonia rebelled, Portugal broke free, and Spain's dominance in Europe cracked. The Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, signaled the empire's retreat as the Netherlands slipped from Spanish hands. By the time Charles II, the last Habsburg king, sat on the throne, the dynasty was spent. Sickly, childless, and frail, he became the symbol of an exhausted empire. At his death in 1700, Spain faced a new chapter of uncertainty, a struggle for its very crown. The death of Charles II ignited a fire across Europe. Who would inherit Spain's vast empire? The War of Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, pitted Bourbon France against Habsburg Austria, with Spain's destiny hanging in the balance. Villages burned, soldiers marched across Castile, and Europe's great powers bled over the Spanish throne. In the end, Philip of Anjou, grandson of Francis Louis XIV, claimed victory and became Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain. Yet victory came with loss. Spain ceded territories in Italy and the Low Countries, shrinking from a continental empire to a more compact kingdom. The Bourbons brought reform. Inspired by French absolutism, they sought to modernize Spain. Roads were paved, trade laws revised, and the navy strengthened to defend overseas colonies. The Bourbon kings envisioned a leaner, more efficient Spain, less the decayed empire of old, more a centralized modern state. But resistance smoldered. The old nobility clung to privilege, regional identities resisted central control, and Spain's progress was uneven. The 18th century became a time of cautious renewal. Madrid grew into a bustling capital with grand boulevards and palaces, like the royal palace that still dominates its skyline. Enlightenment ideas trickled in: science, reason, and reform. Yet beneath the glitter, contradictions persisted. Spain embraced progress, but clung to tradition. It looked outward, but feared change. The Bourbon dynasty had stabilized the throne, but Spain stood on the edge of another storm, one that would sweep Europe and ignite revolution. In 1808, Spain fell under the shadow of Napoleon. At first, French troops entered as allies, marching to invade Portugal. But soon, betrayal struck. Napoleon seized control, forced King Charles IV to abdicate, and placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on Spain's throne. What followed was not submission, but fury. In Madrid, on May 2nd, ordinary citizens rose with knives, muskets, and bare hands against French soldiers. The uprising was crushed, but the fire of resistance ignited across the peninsula. The Peninsular War became a brutal struggle. Spanish guerrillas, fighting in forests and mountains, harassed French columns, cutting supply lines, striking from the shadows. The word guerrilla itself, little war, was born here. British troops under Wellington joined the fight, clashing with Napoleon's marshals across Iberia. Villages burned, civilians suffered massacres, but Spain would not yield. It was a war not just of armies, but of an entire people. Amid the chaos, a new vision of Spain was born. In Cadiz, besieged yet unbroken, deputies from across the land gathered to write a constitution. In 1812, they proclaimed a charter of liberty. Sovereignty lay in the nation, not in the king. It was the birth of Spanish liberalism, a fragile flame flickering in the storm. By 1814, Napoleon's grip had broken, and King Ferdinand VII returned. But the spirit of Cadiz would haunt Spain's future. Victory in the Peninsular War came at a terrible cost. Spain was devastated, its economy in ruins, its people exhausted. Worse still, across the Atlantic, colonies stirred. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals and angered by Spain's weakness, leaders like Simon Bolivar and José de San Martín launched independence movements. From Mexico to Argentina, Spanish rule crumbled. Within decades, nearly all of Spain's vast American empire was lost. At home, Ferdinand VII betrayed the liberal hopes of Cadiz. He restored absolute monarchy, crushing reformers and exiling intellectuals. Each attempt at constitutional government ended in repression, uprisings, and division. Spain was no longer the master of two worlds, but a weakened kingdom, unsure of its path. The 1820s and 1830s deepened the crisis. Military uprisings, pronunciamientos, became common, generals deciding the fate of governments. The once proud empire had shrunk to a handful of colonies: Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Spain had lost its wealth, its prestige, and much of its purpose, entering the 19th century wounded and restless. Spain's 19th century was a storm of civil wars and fragile regimes. When Ferdinand VII died in 1833, a succession crisis erupted. His daughter, Isabella II, was proclaimed queen, but traditionalists rallied behind Charles, her uncle. Thus began the Carlist Wars, bloody struggles between absolutist Carlists and liberal constitutionalists. The wars tore villages apart, families split by loyalty to crown or pretender. Even when the wars paused, politics remained poisoned. Governments rose and fell with dizzying speed, overthrown by coups or palace intrigues. Industrialization was slow, poverty widespread, and regional tensions, Catalan, Basque, Galician, grew sharper. Spain staggered forward, but always limping. By 1873, the monarchy collapsed, and Spain briefly declared a republic. But the experiment failed, descending into chaos, before the Bourbon monarchy was restored under Alfonso XII. The cycle of hope and disappointment continued. Spain was a nation searching for stability in a century that offered none. The end of the 19th century brought Spain's deepest humiliation. In 1898, the United States declared war, and Spain's last great colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, were torn away. The Spanish Navy, once the pride of the empire, was shattered at Manila Bay and Santiago de Cuba. The empire of gold and silver was gone forever. The disaster of 1898 plunged Spain into soul-searching. Intellectuals of the generation of '98, writers, philosophers, poets, asked, "What is Spain now? Stripped of its empire?" Some called for regeneration, others for revolution. Spain turned inward, grappling with poverty, backwardness, and the question of national identity. For ordinary Spaniards, life remained hard. Farmers struggled in drought, workers protested in factories, and anarchist movements stirred in Barcelona. The monarchy survived, but fragile. The empire was gone, only Spain itself remained. The 20th century loomed, with promises of reform, but also the shadow of greater turmoil. In 1931, King Alfonso XIII fled into exile, and Spain proclaimed the Second Republic. At last, many believed, Spain would be reborn as a modern democracy. Women gained the right to vote, schools multiplied, and reforms aimed to modernize agriculture and curb the power of the church. Hope filled the air, but so did fear. Conservatives saw their traditions threatened, while radicals demanded faster, deeper change. The 1930s became a battlefield of ideologies. In elections, left and right alternated power, each undoing the other's reforms. Workers struck in factories, peasants seized land, and churches were burned in riots. Meanwhile, generals plotted in secret. Spain teetered like a rope, stretched between progress and collapse. In 1936, a popular front government of leftists came to power. But within months, right-wing generals, led by Francisco Franco, rose in rebellion. Spain descended into civil war. Cities split, neighbors turned against each other. The Republicans, supported by workers, peasants, and international brigades of volunteers, fought for democracy. The Nationalists, backed by conservatives, monarchists, and fascists, fought for order and tradition. The world watched. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy sent planes and tanks to Franco, while the Soviet Union aided the Republic. Guernica burned under German bombs, immortalized by Picasso's brush. Madrid endured siege after siege, but in 1939, Franco's nationalists triumphed. The Republic fell, its leaders exiled or executed. Spain lay in ruins, its soil soaked with the blood of brothers. Franco ruled Spain with an iron fist from 1939 to 1975. His regime was built on silence, fear, and repression. Thousands of Republicans were imprisoned, executed, or forced into exile. Censorship gagged writers and artists. Loyalty to church, army, and fatherland was demanded. Spain turned inward, cut off from the world, a gray kingdom of scarcity and fear. Yet Franco's Spain was not static. In the 1950s, international isolation eased as the Cold War made Spain a strategic ally for the United States. American bases were built on Spanish soil, and money began to flow. By the 1960s, Spanish miracles of economic growth transformed the country. Highways spread, cities modernized, and millions of tourists crowded the beaches of the Costa del Sol. Behind the facade of authoritarianism, a new Spain was slowly, awkwardly, being born. Still, dissent simmered. Basque separatists in ETA waged a campaign of terror. Students protested in universities, and workers demanded rights. Franco's regime aged, rigid and brittle. When he finally died in 1975, the crowds who gathered in Madrid were hushed, uncertain. The dictator was gone, but Spain's future stood wide open, uncertain, fragile, and filled with possibility. When Franco died in 1975, all eyes turned to Prince Juan Carlos, the grandson of King Alfonso XIII. Many expected him to preserve dictatorship. Instead, he surprised the world by steering Spain toward democracy. In 1977, the first free elections in over 40 years were held. Political parties once banned, socialists, communists, conservatives, reappeared, and Spaniards flooded the polls with hope. But the path was perilous. Old Francoist generals resisted reform, fearing chaos. On February 23, 1981, during a parliamentary vote, armed civil guards stormed Congress, firing shots into the ceiling and holding deputies hostage. For hours, Spain teetered on the edge of another dictatorship. Yet Juan Carlos, appearing on national television in military uniform, firmly ordered loyalty to democracy. The coup collapsed overnight. By 1978, Spain had adopted a new constitution, a parliamentary monarchy, autonomous regions, and a guarantee of rights and freedoms. The Basque Country, Catalonia, Galicia, and others gained self-rule within a united Spain. The nation began to breathe again after decades of suffocation. Democracy was fragile, but it was alive.